The Salem witch trials resulted in witchcraft accusations against more than 150 people and the executions of 20. So what went wrong? We explore this and other facets of the witch hunt in our new podcast, The Thing About Salem, premiering June 1st.
The Thing About Salem offers bite-sized episodes in both video and audio formats that you can enjoy in 15 minutes or less.
I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Our ancestors experienced the Salem witch trials.
And here's a little taste of what you can expect from The Thing About Salem. Possibly Dr. William Griggs decides that the girls, they're not sick in a natural way. They're under an evil hand. Just like that one, Sarah. So what does it mean that they're under an evil hand?
The devil has come to Salem.
The devil's in Salem.
Each week, The Thing About Salem brings you information on a thing from the witch trials.
Episodes will stream on YouTube and all podcast platforms. To get ready, find us at aboutsalem.com.
Be sure to join us for episode 1 on June 1st.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast, the show that explores witchcraft accusations past and present. I'm your co-host, Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're joined by Dr. Nora Groce, professor at University College London, an anthropologist specializing in global health and international development.
Dr. Groce's expertise focuses particularly on people living with disabilities in low and middle income countries, examining the social, economic, and political contexts that create barriers to their full participation in society.
After hearing Dr. Groce present at an online workshop for the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks and the Disability Inclusion Africa Network about how witchcraft beliefs affect people with disabilities, we knew we had to get her on the show to share her expertise and insights.
Today, we discuss why people with disabilities are sometimes targeted for witchcraft accusations, the social constructs that create these vulnerabilities, and how communities can work toward more inclusive approaches.
Dr. Groce shares insights from her research, including a disturbing study on the targeting of people with albinism in East Africa, and helps us understand how traditional beliefs about disability can fuel dangerous stigma.
We'll also learn about the global disability rights movement and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been ratified by 191 countries worldwide.
Thank you for coming on Witch Hunt Podcast. We are so happy to have this discussion with you. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your expertise and interests.
My name is Nora Groce. I'm a professor at University College London, and my area of expertise is actually I'm an anthropologist. I work in global health, international development, with a strong area of concentration on people living with disabilities, especially people in low and middle income countries who live with a disability. And so I look at the social, economic, political context in which they live and the barriers they often face to being full members of the communities in which they live.
Why are people with disabilities targets of witchcraft accusations?
Well, it depends on the society. So not all societies target people with disabilities. And actually, there's an enormous range of variation in how people with disabilities are treated in society, depending on both the societies, the types of disabilities, and of course, the beliefs and how the disabilities occurred, and also dependent on what people in the general societies think about how people with disabilities will be able to adapt to the communities around them as they become adults. So it's more complex in people with or without disabilities. But in a number of communities around the world, we found that people with disabilities are often considered different or other. The issue is why the disability occurs, what could they or their families have done that may have aggravated a divine presence or the divine being, or broken a taboo, or in some way compromised how people in the society is supposed to work. And in those communities, when someone is born with the disabilities, they often, not always, but they often are viewed as different or other and are more likely to fall into the realm of people accused of having or dealing in some ways with witchcraft, or people who can cause a curse or misfortune to occur to others. So it's not universal, but when it's found, it can be a major issue and a major barrier to allowing people who are born with the disabilities or become disabled to be fully integrated into the communities in which they live.
What is important for us to understand about barriers for persons with disabilities when it comes to integrating into the community and life?
Well, the most important thing to understand probably is that the barriers are negotiable, that they don't automatically occur, that people can, when it becomes part of open discussions and attempts to change, societies can change, they can be inclusive. And so if there's nothing inherently in a person's disability that causes these barriers to occur, it's really a social construct. And if people are viewed as other or different, if they're viewed as causing misfortune, if they're viewed as evidence of incest or God's disfavor, then they can be very quickly stigmatized and pushed aside. And the issue is not just a stigma, but the stigma often negates their ability to get lots of resources from the community that would kind of allow them to be full participants. So if you're born with a disability, you're often shunned. Again, not in every community, but for a young child would be shunned, and not other kids might not play with that child. The family may not bring it to family gatherings. When the child gets to school age, that child may not be allowed in school, or may have very, very negative experience in school that will mean that the child doesn't get an education similar to that of their non-disabled peers or their non-disabled siblings, which then it's a negative feedback loop, if you would. That child would then be targeted as a teenager. They'd be less likely to get a job. They'd be less likely to marry, which is, by the way, different than having partners and having children, because we know people with disabilities do that at the same rate as all other people in the community. They're more likely to be barred from attending religious events or social events. So it's not the disability, it's a cumulative negative feedback cycle that would make them increasingly looked at as other, and then have things like accusations of witchcraft thrown at them because, look, they're so different from us. So it's, kind of a lose-lose situation, if you were, for many people with disabilities. So it's not their disabilities, it's a society and the misinformation that they often have to deal with that really makes their lives so difficult. And I should say, alternatively, when people, we know increasingly, we see that when people with disabilities are given the same rights as others, they're allowed to have the same resources, and where needed, get a little extra support if they need it, we know that people with disabilities can thrive and be very much identical to all other members of the community. But importantly, the more that they're denied equal access to the resources and social inclusion, the more likely they are to be othered and then accused of things like witchcraft.
It sounds like all the negative feedback loop, as you described it, really perpetuates poverty and isolation. Are those two problems that people with disability are facing?
That is an excellent question. Poverty, certainly. We know that not all people with disabilities are poor, but people with disabilities are disproportionately poor. And again, it's often not that they can't earn a living, it's that they're denied the right to get the skills or be paid equally. It's not unusual for people with disabilities to work alongside non-disabled people and get less money, less advancement, less choice, less opportunities. And so again, it's an ongoing negative feedback cycle. And in cases where there's traditional beliefs about people with disabilities being in some way other, it could be bewitched, it could be they found disfavor in the eyes of God, it could be that their parents were too closely related, or that their mother is somehow influenced when she was carrying them with some negative event. The disability is a manifestation of that. Especially, you'd like to say, in times before we understood things like basic medicine and prenatal care and all the explanations we have now about why some people are born with a disability, or some people become disabled through illness or diseases as children or adults. But even today, you often have the belief that the issue is not that, say, a child is born with a genetic condition, but, for example, that may have been born with a disability, but we assume that new science will negate old science or old beliefs, but often they're just cumulative. I was working in Nepal once, and I was talking to a woman who had given birth to a baby who had Down syndrome. I was sitting there, and the kid was about 2 or 3 years old, and she was a well-educated woman. In the local village, she had gotten a good education. We were talking about her baby, a really cute little kid, and she said, yes, she loved the baby, but other people were saying things about how this had been an inherited trait. And I said, did doctors explain to you about genetics? And this was not an issue of free birth, it was just genetics. And she said, yes, she understood about genetics, but she said, what could I have done in a past life that would give me these genetics? So the issue was not that she got rid of the idea that in a past life, you or your husband or the baby must have done something wrong for it to be born with a particular syndrome, but the fact that she was combining the best ideas of rebirth and the best ideas of genetics. And again, we think that science negates this stuff, but it doesn't always.
That's a really good example of just what we see, that accumulation of beliefs and fears, and then the new information comes in, but does it bring us to that next place of understanding? And one of the questions that I had, hoping to bring this part of the conversation out, is who believes that disabilities are due to witchcraft, knowing that it can be any of us, and it is a lot of us who think that things happen due to curse or misfortune or a judgment. And I really appreciate you speaking to that.
Yeah, it's not just witchcraft. It's a belief that a series of things have aligned to designate someone with a particular type of disability. So we talk about witchcraft, but it's not just witchcraft. It could be a variety of beliefs that come together. Again, it will depend on the cultural tradition that you're working in. So there's no formula, or at least we haven't mapped one out yet. It will really depend on a bunch of different things. I did a study about 10 years ago with a colleague named Julia McGowan, that we were looking at people who had albinism, called albinos, in East Africa, and there was a spate of killings of people who were albinos, and they were being killed and pieces of their skin being taken, or body parts being taken. And there was a tremendous uproar. It was in 10 years ago. Many of the local governments they moved in right away. Tanzania in particular was very forceful in dealing with this and trying to put down the belief system. But the belief was essentially, if you took a body part from someone who had albinism, it would give you good luck. And so people who had albinism, their lives were at risk, and a number of them were killed. And we looked at it, we heard lots of reports of this. And of course, someone who has albinism is someone who's living with a disability. And so we approached it from who were the people who were doing this? Because if you look in the news, it was all over the news, and this was terrible. And of course, it was terrible. But more than that, what we found was that I thought it's a rural phenomenon. With more education, it'll go away. It's accusations, witchcraft. It's just, for some reason, there's a local flare-up, but the governments will take care of it. We found, however, that the people who were paying all this money, when I say all this money, their body parts for people with albinism were in the range of, I hate to terribly even talk about it, but someone who was albino could pay. Their body could pinch $60,000 or $70,000 US. This is not a small amount of money, nor was it a rural phenomenon. There was a little bit going on in rural areas, but it was mainly in some of the big healing African cities where there's tremendous kind of attention to rising up, making your way in the urban area, And so a lot of younger, really highly, very ambitious businessmen were paying for people to go and kill the people who were albinos so that they could prosper. So it's like a middle class, an upper middle class phenomenon. Well, I should say working class ambitious. You open a small store, you wanted to make a big chain. If you thought that a few magic amulets would help, and they were targeting people with albinism specifically because of this. And it was also mixed in with a couple of other beliefs, the Pentecostal church beliefs about the people who were disabled being evil because they weren't being cured. They couldn't drive the evil spirits out of them. Evil spirits have very little to do if you have a spinal cord injury or something. But so these were the same group of ambitious, often younger people in their 30s or 40s, trying to get ahead in a teeming urban environment. And they were the ones who had these beliefs about magic and basically witchcraft. I would have thought it was a rural belief system, and I would have thought it would be among people who are less educated. In fact, it was among more educated, and it was very much an urban phenomenon.
Which is why data collection like that is so significant when you're studying society, because what it reveals is not necessarily assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really important. We can't just assume that we know about something like witchcraft beliefs, because what you need to do is these issues are affecting people in this day and age, and they're often affecting people who are already in high at-risk populations. And for them to combat these beliefs, to protect themselves throughout East Africa, where albinism is more common because it's an inherited trait, it's a genetically inherited trait. People with albinism themselves have formed themselves into support groups and organizations, and they've been on the front lines advocating for their own safety, own well-being. People who are disabled are not just victims of witchcraft. In communities and in societies where they are at risk, people with disabilities are at the forefront of being their own advocates and their own best advocates on how they want to be treated, and the fact that they have the same rights as all other members of their society. There's a common term for everyone with a disability, and that common term is citizen. So they are all citizens of the countries in which they live. And it's very important not to make people with disabilities look like there's some other group. These are people who are all a part of the communities in which they live. They often share the same beliefs, including sometimes they'll say, I'm not a witch, but there's witchcraft in the community. So that just because you're disabled doesn't mean that you necessarily don't adhere to some of the other beliefs that everybody in your family, all your neighbors believe as well. It's not an easily us versus them thing. It's more a question of thinking through how we redefine disability in a way where it's a very common human phenomenon. We think 16% of the world's population lives with a disability. So roughly 1 in every 7 people. Every household or every extended family will have disabled members. So this is not unique, but how societies deal with disabilities will vary considerably. And that's what you need to think about when you're talking about things like accusations of witchcraft or accusations of people breaking taboos, or accusations of people being against God or ungodly or causing harm or ill health to others. Which is, of course, it ties very much into a lot of what over the years, what people were accused of being witches are accused of being. It's been very common, I think, throughout all of human history where there's beliefs in witchcraft, that people who are disabled are at increased risk for being accused of either being witches or having some alliance with evil or being envious of others and causing others harm. Again, it's not universal, but it's common enough, so we need to be aware of it. And if we're working on issues dealing with modern day witchcraft, to realize that people who are disabled are at increased risk of such accusations. I know we often say, oh, it's women or it's older women and stuff, but people who are disabled, and God forbid you should be an older disabled woman, you are at increased risk for all these things.
Definitely. I know regarding persons with albinism, there was a judgment issued in February by the African court that ruled that Tanzania needs to do more to protect them.
Yes.
Have you read about that? Is there other legislation?
I haven't been working in Tanzania in the past couple of years, so I don't know. The answer is that yes, I think all countries need to do more to protect people with albinism. I think that they're at risk. And also, I think that for a lot of these long-held traditional beliefs, nothing stays fixed. So just because you have a court ruling, you have a meaningful documentary, you get the president of the country to adopt a child with albinism into his family. All of these are great. But I think constant vigilance is important because it's very easy to slide back to beliefs that we think, oh, we've taken care of that. Eugenics is a good example. We think that with all the idiocy surrounding eugenics, we would now look at lots of issues that are being brought up today, especially among some politicians, and say, wait, I thought we solved that. And instead, you're hearing kind of neo-eugenics being bandied around because stupid ideas don't go away. They just are recycled.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of like societal and political neglect of people with disabilities, also efforts to cut funding for projects that assist people with disabilities.
Regrettably, this is the ultimate example of penny wise, pound foolish, because a lot of these programs, it's not just the nice thing to do, it's enlightened self-interest. The more you make people who are disabled self-sufficient, supported, members of the community, the richer the whole community is. The more we get out of everybody in the community, and the more they can contribute. So this isn't a nice thing to do because we feel we want to be gracious or it's not a charity. First of all, it's a fundamental human right. And second of all, it's the more productive, if you want to look at people as productive, I find it a very unhelpful way to look at things. But the more you can get people to be self-sufficient, the more they can both take the burden off of others so that they can decide what they do and don't want to do and have the ability to make decisions on their own, and the more that they can help others. We talk about people with disabilities often as, what should we do for people with disabilities? There's some sort of, oh, we'll do something nice, we'll feel good. This, not a bit of it. That's the most short-sighted thing we can think of. A person who's disabled is, say, take a 40-year-old woman with a disability. She well might have 2 or 3 children and be in a relationship or be married. She may be responsible for supporting her household or doing work around her household. She's responsible often for worrying about her elderly parents. She's a vibrant member of her local church or temple or mosque. This is not the idea that people with disabilities somehow are the end line of what we should do for others. It doesn't hold water for most people with disabilities. Most people with disabilities are engaged in any number of complex networks throughout their society, and they have as many responsibilities as many other people. But it's not just that they're there for other people to do something charitable for them. So there's something called the charity model. We'll do something good for people with disabilities and feel good about ourselves. It's long since been replaced by a social or human rights model. I won't go into all the different models because it's more complex than you need to here, but we hopefully now realize, I say we, but it depends because not everybody is still deaf, that people with disabilities are people who are members of the community. They have the same rights as all others, and they are all part of the, and again, as I was saying at the beginning of the interview, much of what they face in terms of barriers are very much socially mandated or put in place by the surrounding societies. And one thing we know is that societies can change. From the perspective of thinking about it in terms of witchcraft, if a witchcraft accusation came up and for a person with a disability, those networks could be quickly dissolved. People would be able to say, it's not us, we're not that closely related to her, we don't know what she did in a previous life to have been born with a disability or become disabled. But once those accusations occur, I think it's easier for people to distance themselves and saying, we're not disabled, so we're in a different league than the person with a disability. So it's very important. The issue is not to draw the line for people with disabilities between a witchcraft or non-witchcraft, but to go much, much, much earlier, to not even get to the point where there's this issue of who's disabled, who's not disabled. It's a question of a more comprehensive approach to accusations of witchcraft. You say there are a number of attributes in people in certain societies that people look for to make these accusations. And if you can anticipate them and deal with how society frames the other, which is you're different than us. The minute that starts happening, if you're going to wait to saying if people with disabilities or older women or stuff, you're missing the boat. So the issue is, I think, for a lot of the stigma, prejudice, distancing that society does, to maybe think of things to anticipate where you start to get forks in the road between them and us, and to deal with things earlier rather than later, rather than to say, oh, people with disabilities sometimes get accused of being witches or having or practicing witchcraft or being envious and thus able to curse other people or to make other people like them. Long before that, there needs to be a systematic approach in societies to saying we're all the same. This is just normal human difference. And the issue is to focus on how alike we are and not how different we are, and also to focus on making sure, as I said earlier, that people who are disabled have the resources to allow them to be as much a part of their surrounding community as they would like and choose to be. That means things like education, job training, equal pay, the ability to participate in society, the ability to go out into society and be treated with the respect they deserve. Often, if we are attacking key issues to ensure the rights and the value of people with disabilities, we are not waiting till issues of witchcraft come up or accusations of witchcraft come up. We've already discussed in societies ways to counter that. And that can be done in any number of different levels. Schools, certainly, but also massive public relations campaigns or public information campaigns about disability. Long before you talk about witchcraft, you need to talk about how everyone's equal, how everyone deserves the same respect, how everybody has the same rights. And there's been lots of attention to this within, I'd say, the disability community, but the broader global community, and the issue is disability rights. And again, people who are disabled in countries around the world have come together to form a major global disability rights movement, which is often overlooked by people. The general public are not aware of the disability rights movement, but it's been instrumental in putting in place a number of key pieces of legislation. The most significant is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that has now been ratified by 191 countries, I believe. That doesn't mean on a day-to-day basis people with disabilities are always treated equally, but it does mean that in 191 countries, the rights of people with disabilities are now guaranteed, the equal rights of people with disabilities. The United States is not one of the countries that have ratified this, and I fear that, especially in this day and age now, it's like the United States is the only country in the world that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Exactly.
Yes,
Thank you for bringing that up.
It used to be in, I think, South Sudan, but they didn't have a working government. And so when the government came together, one of the first things they did was ratify it. So it leaves the United States in an exceptionally embarrassing situation. Same thing with UN, the rights of persons with disabilities. And that was legislation that was put together. And when the country ratifies it, that means that those rights have to be guaranteed by the government of that country. It's not just a nice thing to do on paper. Their legislation, their policy, their funding have to be put in place. Now, whether it's actually put in place and enacted, there's great variation on that, unfortunately. But the disability rights movement has been going since really the early 1970s, mid-1970s in countries around the world. Just a good film to start an introduction for the U.S. is a film called Crip Camp, which I don't know if you've seen. It's on Netflix. CRIP Camp. It was produced by the Obamas. It was nominated for Best Documentary Film for an Academy Award. It didn't win, but it was in the final 3 or 4, however one does that. And it shows how people with disabilities come together and, in this case, push through major legislation in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the result of global efforts to reframe people with disabilities as full and equal members of society. It's a really important piece of legislation, and it has relevance to people who are worried about things like accusations of witchcraft, because it absolutely is legislation that's been ratified and adopted in many of the countries where we are most concerned about the issues of witchcraft. So it's not, again, on the ground, it's nice to have a piece of legislation. It doesn't make a difference to the safety and well-being of people who are living in communities in these countries. Then it's nice to say, oh, they have the rights. But if they don't have the safety or protection of that law, then it's a real lost opportunity. But that doesn't mean the law doesn't exist, and that people in government don't know about it and can't be held responsible for these sorts of things. And so people with disabilities, we often talk about it as though it's a charitable gesture. It's called a charity model, actually. Where, oh, let's do something nice for folks with disabilities. Again, it's not a question of doing something nice for people with disabilities. It's their right to have the full protection of the law, equal protection. Other groups can't be prioritized over them. We need to really rethink how we're dealing with a lot of things that on a daily basis people with disabilities have to put up with. It's not, even if it's tradition, there's lots of traditions that they're not good for women, or they're not good for members of ethnic or minority communities. Recent American politics aside, that doesn't make it right. And in the same way, the way with people who are disabled have been treated historically in many, not all, but in many communities, is something that we really need to rethink. There will always be people left behind, and some societies are more brutal than others. There's some that are much more equitable or distribute resources on a fairer basis. So societies are whatever people make them. So you can have a tremendously oppressive society as well. You can have a society where women have no rights. You can have a society where people from traditional communities have no voice in our national government. There's all sorts of abuses of power. And we're really talking about power here. Who makes decisions for other people? And who has the right to have a voice in their lives, in the lives of their families, in the lives of their communities? In reality, we need to be constantly vigilant. And again, nothing stays fixed. You need to continually not just say we need to improve the rights of people with disabilities, and things like accusations of witchcraft, for example, have now been negated. You need constant monitoring, surveillance, monitoring, evaluation and monitoring to make sure that things stay fixed.
One thing that's been on my mind, because you had mentioned the public perceptions and how that's communicated through media. How do things like Nollywood films impact the public perception of people with disabilities?
That's an excellent question. Nollywood is an example of that. There were a whole bunch of kind of horror films in the 1990s, 2000s, where people who were disabled were equated with witchcraft and with evil and threats to their neighbors, threats to the community. And of course, it's been very discouraging because they've taken a lot of these themes, and because Nollywood is so broadly distributed throughout sub-Saharan Africa and beyond, it just reinforces old beliefs. I should say that there's a whole field of disability studies, and there are people who've done nothing but gone through and chronicled how people with disabilities are treated in Western literature and Western films. So it's not just Nollywood or Bollywood. There's a whole bunch of films in all these genres where people who are disabled are considered menacing or evil or a threat to the community. So it's playing on the worst of old belief systems, and it reinforces it. And it reinforces it, by the way, often to a new generation. So a lot of these films are targeted at young adults. A lot of them are targeted to young urban adults, the same that we were talking before, that has a belief in if you can get a piece of skin from someone who has albinism, you can prosper. By the way, I should say, we need to be very careful also not to tar everybody with the same brush. So just because there's a belief in a community doesn't mean every member of that community believes that, or every non-disabled person holds the same beliefs about witchcraft and disability. So it really depends on the individuals, their background, what they want to believe, what the families are brought up with, the religious groups they go to. Again, the Pentecostal church in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa have been not particularly helpful with people with disabilities and spreading beliefs about people being taken over by the devil, or just really upsetting and non-productive ways of viewing fellow citizens. But again, it really depends on the individual themselves. And you can get two people, you can get siblings in the same household, and someone will go, oh yeah, that's true. And someone else will go, oh no, that's ridiculous. How could you believe it in this day and age? Again, the issue is to reach and change the opinions of people who have these kind of views. It's not to take a whole community and say they believe. If you did a survey in Mesa, Arizona, or Colorado Springs, or Hartford, Connecticut, you'd find differences in households, you'd find differences between houses, you'd find differences in belief systems of people who are non-disabled and disabled about a lot of these things. So again, we need to be really careful not to say all people believe this. But for those who have a negative opinion towards people with disabilities, it can be for those interactions, for the decisions they make towards people with disabilities, whether it's letting them on a bus or hiring them for a job or allowing them into a training program, or a high school training program for something. If you have negative beliefs, you can have a really detrimental impact on people who are just trying to get through life like all of us are. By the way, I should say, I'm talking about people with disabilities, but I myself am not disabled. And so it's very important that instead of just having people like me who happen to wind up working on disability studies issues over the years, that you reach and listen to people who are disabled themselves. So as basically a university-based researcher, I'm there to provide ammunition for people with disabilities to counter many beliefs and stuff. When I was very young, you'd have discussions about women's health that astonishingly had, you'd have a panel of like 10 people, and none of them would be women. This is what women, you'd have a bunch of gynecologists, but in the same way, or with any group, the issue is not just what I have to say, but what people with disabilities themselves want you to know about their lives, their opinions. And the issue is not that they can't speak for themselves, but they too often aren't listened to. So I'm happy to talk about this, but I will happily yield the floor to folks who are themselves disabled, because I've rarely met a person with a disability who doesn't have plenty to say for themselves.
Yeah, I'll say I live with disabilities, and you're doing an excellent job speaking to concerns I have with American cinema and television. I pay attention to representation and whether it's positive or, people with disabilities get cast in prominent roles or whether they're secondary. And there's just so much ridicule still of people with disabilities in what we see.
Oh, there are a number of people who've done excellent work on mass media and disability, so I won't speak for that whole field, but it used to be, certainly until maybe about 20, 30 years ago, if you ever saw a person with a disability in a film, it was generally either they were an evil character, the Captain Hook missing an arm, or they were an evil menacing character, or they'd be these terrible films where someone would be either cured of their disability in the end or conveniently die. They suddenly learn to walk, or they, again, conveniently die. It was only, I remember, I don't know what the year the film came out, but one film that sticks out in my mind is just, by that By the time it came out, I'd been working on disability for a while, and it was the first film I can remember. Again, I'm not a film person, so I could have missed something. But the film Four Weddings and a Funeral was the first time. I'd already been doing some of my doctoral work on death when it came out. And the reason I was just so struck by Four Weddings and a Funeral of all films was there was the side character, that Hugh Grant's brother was deaf. But it wasn't, nobody was trying to solve his problem. It wasn't the main issue in the film. It was just a side character. And it was the first time I can remember where disability wasn't the key issue. It was just part of life. And since then, it's become much more normal to have people with disabilities in crowd scenes as well as in lead roles. But that was late in the game when it came to how you view disability. So things are changing slowly, but again, it will depend on the film genre and how sensitive the filmmakers are. But too often you still have someone who's kind of a menacing figure or happens to be disabled. Now, having said that, true equality means that people who are disabled can be as evil as anyone else, or as silly, or as like desperate as anyone else. They are just the same as everyone else, but too often we either vilify them or we put them in some sort of saintly role. Again, there's 17% of the world's population. That's 1.3 billion people. And interestingly, people with disabilities has been part of human history as long as we've had human history, and indeed predate human history. So we get a number of skeletal remains for pre-humans, and we routinely, regularly get some individual who's lived with not only has a disability, a broken arm or a head injury, but clearly survived that and lived with those injuries. So it's always been part of human history. And by the way, those kind of skeletal remains show us only the things that are usually trauma or some sort of deformation of the bone structure. It says nothing about mental health issues or problems with, say, vision or hearing that might not show up in skeletal remains. So we've got to assume that disability has always been part of human society. In fact, the first written mention of disabilities that I know of come from cuneiform tablets. I think it was Sumerian, but don't quote me on that. The minute you start having human writing, you have mention of people who are disabled. And this long predates, by the time you get to the Old Testament, it becomes very regularly mentioned. So it's always been part of human history.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Witch Hunt.
Help us spread the word. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode or some clips to your social media.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow. The Salem witch trials resulted in witchcraft accusations against more than 150 people and the executions of 20. So what went wrong? We explore this and other facets of the witch hunt in our new podcast, The Thing About Salem, premiering June 1st.
The Thing About Salem offers bite-sized episodes in both video and audio formats that you can enjoy in 15 minutes or less.
I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Our ancestors experienced the Salem witch trials.
And here's a little taste of what you can expect from The Thing About Salem. Possibly Dr. William Griggs decides that the girls, they're not sick in a natural way. They're under an evil hand. Just like that one, Sarah. So what does it mean that they're under an evil hand?
The devil has come to Salem.
The devil's in Salem.
Each week, The Thing About Salem brings you information on a thing from the witch trials.
Episodes will stream on YouTube and all podcast platforms. To get ready, find us at aboutsalem.com.
Be sure to join us for episode 1 on June 1st.